I
Yeah.
was like, I can make this happen.
Yeah.
And so I made every effort to make it happen. And it really deteriorated me. I became like the worst version of myself. I became my mother. I looked
Yeah.
in the mirror one day and hated myself.
Hello, and welcome to the 40 Drinks podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie McLaughlin. You know, sometime in the years around our 40th birthday, many of us start to feel what I call the ick. Like some part of your life you thought was going smoothly no longer is, and you don't know what to do about it. I know that was true for me, and I fought against it, which only made it a messier process. But having 40 drinks with 40 people over the course of a year helped me escape the influence of that ick. On this podcast, I welcome you to tap into my stories and experience, as well as those of my guests, to help you emerge from your own ick and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes we made along the way. My mission is to make it common cultural knowledge that there is a transition most of us face around age 40, and then showcase so many versions of that transition that every single person approaching or recently turned 40 with dread in their heart knows that they are not alone. Today, my guest is Karen McMahon, whose 40 story is about a high conflict divorce with two very small children, and whose surprise 40th birthday party was the final straw that broke the back of that marriage. Hi, Karen. Thanks for coming to be with me today.
Hey, Stephanie, I'm excited to be here.
I am too. I'm trying to figure out where to start today. You have so much good stuff in your story that I want to dig into and share with everybody, but why don't we just start at the beginning? Can you tell me a little bit about the forces that shaped you into the person that you were in your mid-30s when our story starts? What's the prologue to our story?
Yeah, great question. So I would say the story of my life is I was always very successful externally. I was academically successful. I was a all-star athlete. When I started working, I always did very well. And I was equally unsuccessful in all of my intimate relationships. And so that's like a real nutshell. And I know that my family of origin has a lot to do with that. But in 2020 hindsight, it's so interesting that I would just knock it out of the ballpark every time, no matter what I did externally, professionally, and what have you. And then equally wonder, like, why is it that I struggle so much with romantic relationships?
I relate to that really, really strongly. I was very similar in that there was always terrible boyfriends.
Broken
And
picker.
yeah, broken picker for sure. For sure. I've started recently being curious about what it is I was trying to do. And some of these, were objectively, nice men. They weren't all terrible, evil people. They were just very bad fits. I know I was emotionally not in the right place. And so that's what I was attracting for sure. But also the being outwardly, like for me, it was the same. I worked for the Boston Globe, and then I worked for the mayor of Boston. And then, I did all these really cool, great things. I lived in Ireland for a while. It was like all this like really amazing achievement stuff. And yet for me, it was not only romantic relationships, it was friendships too. I think it was any close relationship I sort of had trouble with.
It's interesting that you say that. In my 30s, it occurred to me that I needed to start breaking up with some of my girlfriends.
Mhm.
And I think my story across the board is I have a heart of service, but I also have an unhealthy side to that, which is the codependence. And so I found myself with a lot of friends in my 30s where the friendships were very one-sided, and I would show up and give, and it was imbalanced, which was the same as my romantic relationships. They were very imbalanced.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing that I could say, I didn't know it then, but now what's fascinating is I always thought I was the lucky one. I never
Mm,
thought he was lucky.
right.
I was the luckier one.
To
And that
have him.
just breaks my heart to think
Yeah.
that way, because now I'm like, somebody better be pretty darn good to
Right.
land me. But
Right.
my whole life, no, I was the lucky one.
Yeah. Right. They were the prize. You weren't the prize. Even though, again, if you look at all those external markers, you were the prize.
Yes.
What was your home life like that kind of set you up for some of these not great patterns?
Yeah. So in my household, mom was first generation Italian, grandma, grandpa off the boat. Dad was first generation Irish, grandma, grandpa off the boat. And Irish Italian is a pretty dangerous cocktail.
Yeah,
So my mom was very young. At 24, she had 3 kids in diapers, and dad was a cop who also enjoyed a drink.
Mhm.
And so I think she was very lonely. She was very angry. And I would refer to her as a rageaholic. In
Mhm.
fact, in my household, the alcoholic was the nicer of the two because dad was a really jolly drunk. And of course, I didn't see him doing the nasty things like
Right.
driving dangerously and soiling the house and things like that. Dad was jolly. And
Yep.
mom was overwhelmed, I think, from the get-go. And her mother, my God bless grandmother, when mom and dad had problems, my grandmother would be like, "What is your problem, Margarita? Take care of your husband." So she had no support there either.
Right.
So I grew up in this household where mom was very controlling, she was very rageful, she was very reactive, and dad was passive aggressive. And so this is my experience of intimate love.
Yep.
And it had that ripple effect going through life. There was a lot of, if you don't want to upset mom, walk on eggshells, be a good girl. What's so interesting, what I've learned is the coping mechanisms that we just brilliantly know to take on as children. We intuitively know the coping mechanisms that will keep us safe.
Yeah.
Well, we then bring those into our adult life and they cause havoc because they're not healthy,
Right.
but they've become part of us. It's the way we behave, it's the way we look at things. And of course, I didn't go out into the world saying, I want to marry. In fact, I was like so certain I didn't want to marry an alcoholic. But it's all the subconscious. So it doesn't matter consciously what we're thinking. So I went and I recreated my family of origin in my household.
So you told me you got married a little on the late side. You said you were in your mid-30s when you got married.
Yeah.
Well,
And I left home at 19. So
okay.
I
So you've
I
been on your
was
own.
I was out on my own. I had a lot of different relationships. I had some great jobs. I was independent. I wasn't needing anyone. I have an older and a younger sister. And I was like, I am never getting married and having kids.
Right.
I'm the only one who got married and had kids.
Okay. So what was it about this guy that went from being just, another boyfriend to, okay, let's go ahead and do this and build a life together? How did that happen?
Yeah, I think that if I were to be honest with myself, my age had something to do with it. I worked in the city, so it wasn't like I had all these girlfriends getting married and having babies. It was just like my biological clock. I was in an unhealthy relationship before I met my husband, and I chuckle.
Yeah. Matter of degrees.
Yeah, so in comparison, he seemed healthy, but he's definitely on the narcissistic spectrum. And so when I met him, I was in real estate and he was selling his house and he was just this charismatic guy. He had 2 water view houses on the North Shore of Long Island. He had his own business. He had this whole presentation that wasn't very real. And so I was like, "Oh, here's a guy. He's handsome, he's funny, he's obviously successful." He was not successful. And he was entertaining and it seemed like a good fit. And I think that we were both at an age, we were 1 year apart, and just it seemed like the right way to go. And I fell in love. I thought he was great. I was the luckiest girl in the world,
Yep.
really, until I wasn't.
Right. And by that point, you had a couple of little kids.
Well, actually, the story is interesting if we could. So
Please.
I was a real estate agent. His first house, we literally sold like 24 hours before the bank took it over. The second house, I had a buyer. I was like dancing, just trying to get this thing closed, and the bank took it about a week before we closed on the second house.
Oh, wow.
So those are some pretty big red flags. Like, how
Yeah.
did you get here?
Right.
But then we were engaged to be married, and I walked in one day, and he talked about his mom like she was the Blessed Virgin Mary. Like, I thought, there is no way I am ever going to be able to. And she's lovely, lovely, salt of the earth woman. And I walked in one day, and he was screaming, yelling, and cussing at her like no tomorrow. And I remember saying, "Please tell me that wasn't your mom. And are you going to call her back and apologize?" Red flag. No,
Yeah.
I'm not. She was wrong. And then we were going to Aruba for our honeymoon, and it turned out that he didn't have a license. And I'm like, "What do you mean you don't have a license? I've been driving around with you for a year and a half." Well, my license was suspended because of X, Y, and Z, and I haven't paid my property taxes. And so people sometimes say, "Were there any red flags?" And I
Yeah.
like to say it was a little bit like the 4th of July grand finale, but me with my very lovely rose colored glasses. And I also had a feeling like I said this to a family member once. I said, here I am. I've fallen in love with this man. I'm about to go in front of an altar and say, for better or for worse, until death do we part. And I'm about to bail. That doesn't seem right.
Mm.
But that was my mindset was how loyal am I if I just bail because I see that he has some faults?
You're probably also able to talk yourself into, this is just a phase, and if we get through this, we'll be on the other side of it, and it'll make us stronger, and, all of those things we tell ourselves when we're in bad relationships.
And I'm strong and I'm capable and I can
Right.
help him change.
Right. 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 Oh my
Yeah,
god.
that word change.
Do you have any sense today of why you ignored all the red flags? How you were able to convince yourself that they weren't flapping in the breeze?
When I was in therapy, when everything started unraveling, one of the things my therapist said was, your pain tolerance is so high that I think you would stay until you were dead. And I wasn't in a physically abusive relationship. It
Right.
wasn't like that. But she said, I think you would just stay. And so when I reflected on that, it brought me back to my family of origin.
Yeah.
And, you know, I feel like it's very easy for us to beat ourselves up when we're in that position. And yet, I believe that I was kind of predestined because the only intimate love I knew was so broken and had that. So my ex-husband was the rageaholic that my mom was, very, very bad, still does, terrible anger management. And he was a pot smoker. So he wasn't the alcoholic, but it was the same thing. And
Right.
so I remember saying to my best friend, I was like, I was trying so hard not to marry my dad. And there's a book called Getting the Love You Want with the
Okay.
Hendricks. And they say that we attract a lover or a partner that has the wounds of our parents in order to heal. So in a healthy relationship, two people can come together and say, I see your inner child, you see my inner child. And we can create space and love and grace for healing. Mine was a toxic relationship, and so it went very much, and I equally participated in
Yeah.
telling him how bad he was and him telling me how bad I was. And so, yeah.
Your comment about pain tolerance is so interesting to me. I was just telling you this before we started, but in the fall, I had a surprise spinal surgery. Now, how you have surprise spinal surgery is beyond me, but I've had neck issues and trouble with my neck since I was a little kid, like 15. And so I've been seeing my chiropractor since I was 15. And so they're practically family. When I finally got to the point where I was seeing a surgeon, and I saw two surgeons within a week for, first and second opinion, the first one said to me, I had a patient who was in the same situation that you are physically with where my neck was from a degenerative standpoint. He said she had been in a wheelchair for 2 years. She was not able to walk. But look at you, you're like carrying on. This is now I'm extrapolating from this. But me, I was running a business and starting a podcast and running a home and being in a marriage and managing some chronic illnesses on top of all of this. And so your statement about pain tolerance really kind of hits me in the gut a little bit because I definitely think that I have an element of be strong running through my character as well. So you get married and then you have a couple of little kids. How were the first, 2, 3, 4 years of that marriage while you were having babies?
So, I mean, in some ways it was beautiful and lovely. One of the interesting things was my ex would bring flowers home all the time. He would bring me cards. My friends would be like, "Oh, you're so lucky."
Mm.
Flowers and cards are really easy. And so I was a full-time working mom. I didn't want to after the second child, but we had other problems. Anyone who listened so far would go, yeah, were they financial? Yeah, they were financial. So I was in sales and I would come home. I was selling commercial printing. I'd come home and I finally landed that account and they buy $1 million worth of printing and I'm going to get a little piece of it. And I'd come home and I'd celebrate with him and he'd go out and spend like $25,000, $30,000 before I landed the first job, got the first commission check. And then he'd be like, you're so cheap. Like you never spend any money. And I'm like, I can't spend what we don't have and it's gone by the time it comes in. And so I never get to enjoy.
Right.
And so this was such a big issue for us. We bought a house that we ended up refinancing 5 times and never putting a penny into it.
Wow.
So we bought this gorgeous English tutor. It was just like a crown jewel. And because of his propensities, we had to always have brand new cars that were leased and the nicest house on the block and, all the trophies, the trophy kids and the trophy car and the trophy wife and all of this. And we had 2 cents in our pocket and the bill collectors were calling all the time. So even in those early days, it was so confusing to me because some things were so lovely. And I had my family, my little babies, and I was getting flowers and cards. And I wasn't sleeping at night and there was no money in the bank. And so it was just this very confusing time. I can soldier on, just like you soldiered on with your spinal injury. I was like, I can make this happen.
Yeah.
And so I made every effort to make it happen. And it really deteriorated me. I became like the worst version of myself. I became my mother. I looked in the mirror one day and hated myself.
Oh, let's move on to your 40th birthday.
That was another telling story. So my ex turned 40 the year before me and big friend group. So I remember throwing him a surprise party. And one of my girlfriends said, let's put a whole poster board of pictures together. And I said, if you want to do that, you can. I am not bloody doing that. I don't want to look at those. So it was already like at the end of my rope. And then when wine came around, I said to him, whatever you do not throw me a party.
Yeah.
We haven't been away since our honeymoon. So we need time alone. And he would never go. He was the dad. And he was like, nope, not leaving the kids. And his parents lived 10 blocks away. They practically raised my kids because we both worked.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't. And so I said, I'm telling you, we need a second honeymoon. And if you're going to do anything for me, I don't care if it's even on Long Island, let's do that. And I walk into his parents' house and surprise.
Yeah.
I put on my best face.
Yeah.
And I would think I decided that night, like that I was done.
Yeah.
You don't see me, you don't hear me, but you keep giving me flowers and cards.
So you must be a good guy.
Yeah.
At what point did you finally realize you don't see me, you're not listening to me? Like at what point did it go from just being how it was to you understanding that he wasn't listening to you?
So my daughter was born at the end of December in 98. And by 2000, it was her birthday. And we had our one physical altercation that I began. And I was just so triggered. And at one point, he looked at Dominique, 2 years old and adorable, and said, Mommy's ignoring you because she doesn't love you. And I was elbow deep in chicken grease trying to put a chicken soup together. And he was sitting there and she needed something. And I kept asking him, would you please just stop reading the paper and just help her for a minute? And that was his response. And I took my greasy hands and I wrapped them around his neck before I even knew it. Talk about like action before it crosses your like prefrontal cortex. I was across the room with my greasy hands around his neck, screaming at him to never, ever speak to our children or say something like that again.
Yeah.
And he grabbed me, he threw me up against the cabinet and told me to never lay hands on him again. And I went upstairs. He took the kids. Mommy's crazy. I think he took them to Wendy's or something to have a little meal. Mommy's crazy. And I went upstairs. I looked in the mirror. That was the moment that I hated myself. I cried my eyes out. Yeah. And whatever day that was, the next business day, I was on the phone with the therapist. And I was like, I am very lost and I am very scared. And this should be the happiest time of my life. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old and they're adorable and I love them and I'm miserable. Yeah. And things have gone so far off of the rails. It was just shy of 7 years. It was 6 years 6 years in.
Wow. So from the time you called the therapist and started that process, how long until you started divorce proceedings? Did
Yeah.
those happen around the same time or?
No, not at all.
Okay.
As you know, as is so typical, actually, especially in these high conflict situations. And so I went to a therapist for a while, and then I asked him to go to marriage counseling, and we went to one or two or three marriage counselors. And I remember one of the marriage counselors, the third one probably, I asked him if we could. And my ex-husband is verbose. So just getting a word in edgewise is hard. We'd go and I'd sit there and I'd listen to him.
Yeah.
So I met with the marriage counselor, and it was funny because I remember the guy saying to me, so what is it that you want to know? And he said to me at the end of the session, he said, Karen, he's not hearing you. He's not seeing that there's any problems, or certainly not on his side. And so, what do you need? What do you want to do?
Yeah.
And he was very gentle about it, but kind of blunt in the same way. I think he kind of wanted to say, do you expect me to fix him? Like,
Right.
I really got the sense that he was like, you're a pretty sharp woman. Aren't you seeing what I'm seeing happening in these sessions? And I ended up hiring an attorney. So that was 2 years later that I hired the attorney, and then he went ballistic. Terrible story about what happened when I hired the attorney, if you want me to go into it.
Yes, please.
So my mom went with me. I found an attorney. I hired an attorney, and he found the papers. And so I go to his parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner, and he has shown the divorce papers to his entire family. And I walk in, and I am the evil one.
Yeah.
And I think I got thrown out. I don't completely remember. And that was Thanksgiving. And then I put the whole thing on hold because he begged me. He would beg and plead and beg and plead. After our whole marriage, every time we fought, he would throw divorce at me, and my parents got divorced. So, that piece was in there. So I thought, you know what? I owe it to myself and my kids and him to try. So we went through Retrovi. Retrovi it used to be called Marriage Encounter years ago, but it was this 3-day, 30-hour Christian run program. And we both found the spark of what we had fallen in love with. And then there was a program that went for a couple of months after that. And one of the things you had to do was dialogue every day. You would write and then you would dialogue. And it was like the key component of it was the communication. And he would go get high and then sit down to dialogue. And I'd say, I'm not dialoguing with you.
Right.
If we're going to dialogue sober. And at that point, that July, so it was 7 months later, I was locked in my son's room the entire July 4th night. And he was on a rage. And I was scared for all of us. I remember calling my attorney, whatever the next business day was, and said, move forward. And if I ever call you to tell you to pause again, don't listen to me.
Yeah.
I almost don't trust myself, but I don't think I'm going to turn back. And I can't because, one of the things in these kinds of situations is my family was really worried for me. And I was like, he's just angry. You know him. He just gets angry. And that was only 6 years. But first, my tolerance from my childhood, and then the normalization. It's like I live with him calling me these nasty names and having a short fuse and screaming and yelling at the kids. Like, so you live with this and it becomes so sadly normal.
Yeah.
So the outside goes, you're in danger. And you're like, oh, don't overreact. It's not that bad.
Right. Right. He's just a blowhard. He likes to let off steam. He's a yeller.
And he'd never laid a hand on me. So I was like, I'm not actually in danger. But the truth was, you're supposed to be my guy. You're supposed to have my back. Like, I'm supposed to feel more safe with you than anybody else.
Yep.
You're supposed to protect me.
Yeah. Hi, we'll get back to the conversation in just a minute. With more than 100 episodes under my belt now, I've been thinking about how I can continue to make the show better. And to do that, I sincerely want to engage with you. I want to say explicitly that I want to hear from you, and I want you to feel really welcome to ask me questions. Ask me anything you ever wanted to know about turning 40, about the 40 transition, about what my guests have shared in their stories. I also want to say out loud, because I don't do it enough, that if you want to learn more about this 40 transition, please consider getting on my email list where I explore the topic in different ways than I do here in my guest episodes. And if there's anything you'd like to hear more of on the 40 Drinks podcast, I am open to your suggestions. My biggest goal is to be a resource for those of you going through the transition. So if there's something else that might be useful to you, please let me know. You can do all of that on my website, 40drinks.com, and don't forget to spell out the word 40. There's a contact button right at the top of the page if you want to drop me a line, and then there's a subscribe button as well if you want to get on that email list. And finally, if you're enjoying today's conversation, I would love it if you would hit subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who might appreciate this exploration of midlife's twists and turns. Your engagement helps me continue to bring these amazing stories to light. All right, back to Karen. So once you moved forward with the divorce, then the conflict amped up?
Oh, big time. 3.5 years. I lived in the attic of my house, and thank God we had a beautiful English tutor. So there was a finished attic, and I had asked him to leave the master bedroom, which he did, but then he came back pretty quickly. And I realized I just need to leave. And my kids were so little, I didn't want to be on a separate floor from them. But we went through and I couldn't leave because it was the marital home. So he could go to school on Monday and pick up the kids and take them home. And then I'd be living someplace else and they'd be living with daddy. And I was like, that's not happening. They are not living there alone with this unhinged man.
Yeah.
And so I stayed for 3.5 years. At the end, I remember calling my attorney and saying, I am going to jump out the third floor window. You do whatever you have to do. I have got to leave with these kids. We're dying.
Yeah. Wow. There's a part of me, and I've never been through a divorce, so I don't understand this, but there's a part of me that doesn't really understand. I mean, I've seen divorces, friends, family, and it's like, oh, okay, now the kids split their time between A and B.
There was no custody agreement. He wasn't going to agree to anything. And so they had one legal home, and that was the marital home.
I see.
It's not the case everywhere. I'm in New York, and he was hell-bent on keeping those kids. And I wasn't even fighting over custody so much. I wanted to have more like 60-40. Like I wanted him to be with me a little bit more because dad was pretty unhinged. But he was a little OCD. And so he would actually sit and count the minutes. Like he needed to have them as many sleeping minutes as I did.
Wow.
Like it had to be 50-50 down to the last second. My attorney, who had already been doing it for 30 years, was like, he was apoplectic about my soon to be ex. He was like, I have never in my life.
Wow. So 3.5 years you are living in the attic of your home.
Yeah.
And I think you told me you had walkie-talkies.
Yeah. It's very heartbreaking. So my daughter was just such an innocent little thing, but they just say what they think too. So I tried to make it fun. And so they had walkie-talkies. So if they needed me, they could call me and either they could come up or I'd go down and we'd have little play dates in the attic. The attic was like 110 degrees 12 months out of the year too, because heat rises. But there were 2 locked doors. So on the second floor, there was a door with a staircase. And then there was my bedroom door on the 3rd floor. So for me, I was at least a little safe behind the 2 locked doors. They would get walkie-talkies. One of the things I say to my clients now is don't assume that the good child that's flying under the radar. Don't assume that they're good. And so my daughter was a straight A student and she used school as an escape and she dove in and she was very self-sufficient. My son, there's about 4 or 5 years where you'll see every picture of him. I was just showing him pictures the other day. His mouth is smiling and his eyes are dead.
Wow.
And so it's heartbreaking to even talk about and remember because it had such a debilitating impact on everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm very curious, and I don't usually go this direction with these conversations, but because you were so clear about what your childhood did to you, when you came out of this marriage and understanding that you had kind of recreated your childhood home,
Yeah.
what kind of things did you do to make sure that your kids ended up
Okay.
on a better footing than you did?
Yeah. I put them in therapy right away. So they were in therapy from the get go, as soon as I was willing to acknowledge that we had a big problem. And then I went to the school, and our school district had a banana splits program, and it was group therapy for kids. And so I went to the social worker and told her my story. And she said, I have no interest in your opinion or your story. I'm not taking sides. I care about your kids. She became my biggest advocate. She was so upset with what the kids were dealing with. So they had that. So they had therapy. But my ex, there's so many things that he did against the rules. One of the things that everyone's told is certainly don't tell the children anything about the
Right.
divorce, keep it age appropriate. And so at one point, he told my son, if you ever tell anyone anything that goes on in this house that might seem negative, I will get arrested and you'll never see me again.
Oh my God.
So CPS was called 3 times, and so we had to go through this CPS thing 3 times on me, all 3 times on me.
Oh
No,
God.
no, I'm sorry. Once the first time, I think a court person did it on us, and the other 2, my ex did on me. But my son, the CPS workers would go to the school with the social worker and sit down, and my son would cross his arms, and he'd take the 5th. And the CPS person said, I have never had a child do that before. And he was so like he had all this power. Like he was so afraid that he could destroy his father's life
Yeah.
that he just swallowed it and kept it in. He used to be like everything would roll off his back. He was happy and jolly, which he is now again. But for years, he was a walking raw nerve. It was just heartbreaking.
Mm.
Yeah. But I was in a 12-step program. I went into Al Anon
Mm.
and I was in therapy constantly. They were in therapy, and I began to learn about boundaries. And I really used all of these difficult situations where the kids got hurt by their dad. I never talked about their dad. I talk about what happened. I'd say, what happened? What did you do? How did you feel?
Yep.
How would you have liked to behave? And I just thought, I'm going to use every challenge as an opportunity to increase their emotional awareness and intelligence and ability. For my daughter, I remember saying to her once, tell daddy. And she goes, no, he's going to yell at me. And I had so lost my voice. I said, Dominique, he yells at you all of the time. I want you to hold on to your voice. So if that's how you feel, you open your mouth, you say it, and then you call me back. But don't lose your voice. And to today, my daughter's 25 years old and nobody can shut her up, man. She speaks her mind. She's one bold badass. And I'm really proud. And my son, I thought if I could raise a young man that I'm proud of, he's a beautiful human being. And they have their issues. I'm not saying they did not emerge unscathed,
Yeah.
but I believe that one healthy parent can make a world of difference. I just did everything in my power to get healthy because I was in such a bad place.
Yeah. Wow. This whole situation took up the better part of your 40s. I mean,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
your 40th birthday, you said it was a couple more years before you actually pulled the trigger on the divorce. And then it was 3.5 years. I mean, so we're talking like late 40s by the time you're coming out of this.
Yeah, so my divorce was final in October 2006.
Mhm.
And I finally got to move out of the house in June of 2006. And I found a place 10 blocks away because he was really restricting I wanted to
Mhm.
be 2 towns away, and he would have none of it. And I was just tired of fighting. So I was
Yeah.
just like, I am going to say yes to everything that I can deal with. And I will tell you that the day we moved out, I was just talking to my kids about this. It was a barn, really. We called it a carriage house, or I did because it sounded nicer.
Yeah.
But it was really a barn, and with like indoor, outdoor shimmy carpet on the floors and stuff. And we went in and we brought a box of pizza. And my daughter took that little table in the middle of the pizza pie and she was like, look, our first piece of furniture. And we camped out and we had a pizza on the living room floor. And it was overnight that I felt like an elephant had stepped off of my chest, to not have to
Wow.
drive back home, to not have to walk in that door, to not have to avoid or confront or whatever, was the most liberating experience I've ever had.
Yeah. Wow. How long from then until you felt healthy, good? Because I know you said you'd been in therapy during this whole process, but,
Yeah.
I mean, you don't just shut the door on that and go, all right, I'm good. How long did it take you to recover from that?
Well, in 2010, I went into a coaching program and I thought, I've done my work. I'm really excited. I was really pleased with the human being that I turned into. Like, it was a fire of refinement and I really changed a lot of my own behaviors, and I felt good about myself. And then I went into the coaching program and saw there was so much more to do.
Mm,
So back then I would have said to you, yeah, when I emerged in 2006, I was well on my road to recovery. But 4 years later, I was learning a lot more about myself. And, it's like an onion, you just keep peeling back layers. And I think that people who do what you and I do, podcast, coach, this kind of thing, people can look at you and think, wow, you've arrived. And there is no arriving.
yeah.
We're all onions and there's many, many layers. And I think that for me, at some point during that journey, I decided that my primary goal, I had two goals in the world. One was to raise two very healthy humans that I could be proud of. And the other thing was that my only job was to spend every day trying to be the best human being that I could. And so I was going to spend the rest of my life refining myself. And I can't tell you how often I'm in coaching sessions and I hang up the phone or get off of Zoom and go, yeah, that one was for me too.
Oh my God, Karen. I do that. I say that about the podcast. I've said this over and over again. Every third or fourth interview, I hang up with somebody. I go, yep, that one was for me.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like built in.
Yeah. I've found for me, it's cyclical too, right? I think, the first time I kind of even opened my eyes to any personal development kind of stuff, I might have been like 27 or 28. And then a lot of stuff happened in my life, 36, 37, 38. And then 40 was a big transition for me. And it was after I went through that transition that I came to understand that this is actually a developmental stage that most of us go through sometime around age 40. And so I went through it, and I like to say at the end of my 40 drinks project, my life was completely changed. There was some smooth sailing for a while, but then it's like an onion, it's like a renovation. We're doing some work on our house now. We've been there 5 years. And last year we redid the bathroom upstairs, and they're like, "Okay, we're done with projects. That was a lot." And this year we're like, well, we don't want to do the kitchen because that's too much based on what we did last year and how big of a project that was. Well, what if we just painted the dining room and the living room? And then next thing you know, you've like peeled back a layer almost accidentally. And you're like, oh, well, now we got to get furniture and now we got to do this and that
Yep.
wall's got to come down. And so for me, this personal growth stuff, it's cyclical. You deal with an issue or with something in your life, a pebble in your shoe, and you get through it. And then you have a period of calmness, of integration, of, enjoying your growth. But if you're open to it, oh, there's another pebble in my shoe. Maybe I should address that one. And, and once you start opening your eyes, you start seeing things, friendships. Well, maybe I should understand what's going on there. It really is an ongoing process of evolution once it begins.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, one of the really big things for me going through my divorce was I was raised Roman Catholic. I kind of went in and out of the church through the years, went back when I had the kids. But then after the divorce, I just leaned in hard and or during the divorce, I had no place else to go. So I just thought, I have to have faith because
Mhm.
I'm in so much fear that if I don't have faith, I'm going to just crumble. And that's been a huge part of what's directed the rest of my life too. Me and my sisters were assaulted by a neighbor, sexually assaulted by a neighbor when we were young. So we all started in therapy very young. So those, I think, were the two pivotal things, the broken household and then this horrendous human being who hurt us so badly. And that's part of why I thought I'm pretty evolved. I've been doing this a while.
Right.
I really was a little taken aback by my own shortcomings, because I thought I've been in therapy. I've been talking about my mom issue. I've been talking about, the rape. I've been talking about these different things. And yet here there was so much more. And I think that that's part of what we really need to honor is when we have these traumas, they're in ourselves, they're in our subconscious. There's so much that goes on. And I think now in recent years, there's so much more of a honoring and understanding of trauma and unconscious belief systems and how we're often driven by things that we don't even know are driving us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing that I have been learning over the last 6 months to a year is that trauma can mean a lot of things. It doesn't have to mean huge traumas, capital T traumas. It can mean being yelled at to stop crying, because then you learn not to have emotions. You learn to swallow your emotions. You learn to shove them down, and you learn to relate in a way where you're shut down. Trauma is something that most of us have, no matter how good or bad our childhoods were or our families of origin were. I mean, because I was
Because
just,
everyone's human, right? So our
yes,
human parents only have their own experience.
a friend of mine, a former guest, Mitch Webb, just recently was posting social clips from the podcast, and I was saying something in one of the clips, and I was like, "Wow, look at how smart I was." But it was like I was talking about trauma, and I was saying trauma can be anything that shook you,
Right.
and the shook got stuck.
Absolutely. One of the things my mom would do the most, and she was a therapist, is she would tell me to stop being so sensitive.
Yeah.
And so one of the patterns in all my relationships was, yeah, I wasn't low maintenance. I was no maintenance. You needed to do nothing for me. And so I met men who did nothing for me.
And imagine how beautifully sensitive you actually are, and what a superpower that can be when it's tended to appropriately.
I remember my mom telling my daughter that once. She was maybe 7 or 8, and, the girls, you'd cry easily and what
Yeah.
have you, and she came running upstairs, and I practically threw my mother over the balcony. I was like, "Don't you ever, ever, you therapist, don't you ever speak to my daughter that way again." I was like, and it made me realize, I was like, "Oh my goodness, don't I have a trigger there?" Like, I
Yeah.
was so viscerally angry that she would do that to Dominique and not be kind and gentle. But, and then again, my mom only knew what she came from. So
Yeah. So, what is life like for you on the other side of all of this, Karen? What did you learn? What are you doing?
being a single mom, co-parenting with an angry, hostile ex was hard. So I just had to tell my story, which is why I know I'm 18 years post-divorce, and my kids are 25 and 27. They went through severe problems. And so the first thing I decided were, they didn't ask for this, and they're my number one priority. And so I spent a lot of years, even while I was building my coaching business, keeping my daughter alive, helping my son, being truly the only parent that they had. And so you find coping, like my best friend was at both of their births. So I called her and I said, "You are my new co-parent. You lasted the long run and he didn't. He's not here. He's not showing up." And so she became the person that I could lean on and talk to and worry with and what have you. And in 2010, I remember I was 4 years post, and I thought, I was still selling commercial printing, and I thought, I am such a transformed version of myself. There has to just be something more important that God has put me on this earth to do than sell ink on paper. It just was falling pretty darn flat at that point.
Yeah.
And I got into coaching. I went through the coaching program. They said pretty early on, think about a niche. And I was like, let's see, coaching is about transition, child of divorce, adult of divorce. I'm going to be a divorce coach. And I just knew I hit the ground running. I felt like I was in God's flow of my life. and I've never regretted it. My divorce is so far behind me. People are like, why would you want to be talking about and dealing with divorce? It's just people are at their sloppiest. And I feel like I've been given this gift of being able to see someone in their brokenness and help them see the possibility of what life could be. And sometimes people hire me because they'll say to me, I have no hope, but you seem to have so much hope for
Right.
me. I'm actually going to hold on to that.
Right. I'm going to let
And
you see it before I
yeah,
can see it.
yeah.
Mm.
And I have a beautiful series on my podcast, Voices of Celebration. And it's not celebrating the divorce. None of it celebrates the divorce. It celebrates the journey.
Yeah.
Because there's really no destination. It's just a journey. And so the journey to find your voice, to set boundaries, to tamp down your fear, to find your faith, to whatever it is. And I could pinch myself that I get to touch lives in such a special way, and I can make a living off of it. And I keep learning and growing. And so I remember calling Sue, my best friend, and saying, this was right after the divorce. I said, as hellacious, and that's the best word I could use, as the last 3.5 years have been, I am so surprised and pleased with the human being that I've become, that if I had to do it all over again to be who I am today, I would do it on a dime.
Right.
And to me, that's when I realized everything is for us.
Right.
It's all for us. It's just really damn hard sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's never on our time frame. But when you face trials and tribulations and you can keep the focus inside on what's my part and what can I do and how can I be better, how can I take care of my kids, whatever it is, you are growing in such a beautiful way. We have a saying, to turn the shit of divorce into the compost of a new life. And it really is such a nice metaphor for being able to take what can be so hard and devastating and use it as fuel to create a better life. And that's what I feel like I've done and what I try to help my people do.
Oh, I love that. It's so funny to me through all these conversations that people say it different ways, right? My mess becomes my message. My pain becomes my purpose. Sometimes it almost sounds trite, but so many people that I've met through this podcast go through that messy time, the messy middle, and come out of it in a way that they say, I can help. I can help people do it better than I did. Frankly, it's what I'm doing as well. People who are turning 40 or somewhere around that, right? 35 to 45, don't know that this developmental stage is coming for them, that they're going to go through a transition. And it could be in any part of their life. It could be at any point. And so I'm taking the mess that I made and hoping that I can make it easier for someone else, just the same way that you're doing, and so many others as well.
Like, I've had people say, just get real angry at me. Are you freaking kidding me? She's the problem or he's the problem. And I look at my ex-husband, and maybe he's just not capable because of his mental health issues, but he went through the same hell that I went through.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't have anything to show for it. And so, for your listeners, it's like, even if you're resistant to doing the work, it's like, whatever your hell is, whether it's career or health or relationship, you're going to go through it. Why
Yeah.
not grow through it? Why not use that as the fuel to be a better version of yourself?
100%. I mean, that when you were saying that a moment ago, I was thinking, yeah, we're all going to go through a mess. What are you going to do with it? It's up to you to make it mean something, or to make it matter, or to make it have a reason, to use it to make sure that the next steps and the next stage are better, stronger, happier, more successful, all of those things.
I just recently, Forbes came out with a report last year, and they said that divorce rates for first marriages are around 50%. And you think, okay, well, a lot of people get remarried. What's second marriage divorce rate? 67%.
Oh, wow.
Some people get married a third time. Are we doing it right the third time? 73%.
Wow, it goes up.
So if you don't do the work, you marry the same person with a different face and a different body, you rinse and repeat. And at that 7-year mark, you're going to say, why does this keep happening to me?
Mhm.
And it doesn't happen to us.
Yeah.
We participate. And I think that for those who are bold and courageous enough, because it takes courage to look at yourself and own your stuff, they're the ones who can remarry, and it can be beautiful.
Oh, Karen, I have loved everything about this conversation. It's been so wonderful to have you. And I just want to thank you for being so generous with your story.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you for what you do. I think that this is a beautiful podcast. I've really enjoyed listening to the stories.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thanks so much for listening today. This was such a harrowing story. And many of my guest interviews are, because this transition period, sometime around age 40, can be a doozy for so many of us, myself included. And I can really relate to Karen in the part of her story that was the most harrowing, where she said that her husband said something that just set her off. And I think I mentioned this in another recent episode wrap up, where there are just some people that when we put ourselves together with them, they bring out the worst of us. We become somebody other than our true selves. And so I really can relate so strongly with Karen in that position of just absolutely losing her mind. Oh, and my wish for you, yes, you, is that when you see the red flags in any relationship, that you have the guts and the internal fortitude to do something about them. Make that hard decision. Make the change. Change direction. Don't just get swept along in the river of your life thinking that it's too late or there's been too much invested or whatever other garbage we tell ourselves to make that change. You gotta do something different. How much pain and suffering could be avoided if we just minded the red flags? And I just got a picture in my head of like a downhill ski racing course, which I've probably only ever seen on the Winter Olympics. I certainly haven't seen them in person. But those flags that mark the course are there for a reason. They show us the path. They mark out the area where we will be safe as we make our way down the mountain. And think of your red flags as similar. It's our intuition, our gut instinct telling us that something isn't right, that we are potentially headed for danger. And every time we ignore the red flags and override our intuition, we find ourselves in a bad place. Oh, I am thinking of a relationship of my own that I had with an alcoholic man when I was in my early 30s. If I'm honest with myself, there were red flags from very early days, but I overlooked them. I explained them away. I justified them. And listen, if you're somebody who constantly ignores or overrides the red flags like I did for a very long time, please know that it is not too late to make a change. Every time you encounter a red flag, it's another chance to practice doing something different. So, again, my wish for you, yes, you, if you're still listening, then this message is for you. I will lend you some of my hard earned internal fortitude so you can make that hard decision, make the difficult choice, because your life is waiting for you. And know that once you make that difficult decision and break that cycle, even just the very first time, you've made a change. You've started on that journey of personal growth. And remember from earlier in the conversation with Karen that personal growth usually comes in waves. And earlier in the conversation, I said it was cyclical. And you might be into it for a period of time. For me, the first time I jumped in, it was like a year while you work on something specific. Maybe it's listening to your intuition or learning why you always choose such terrible romantic partners like Karen and I did for so long. You deal with an issue or with something in your life that you want to change. And then you make your way through it and you come to a natural end point. And you have a period of integration where you can enjoy that hard won growth. You can just take some time of smooth sailing. until the next issue you want to deal with comes bubbling up into your awareness. Then the cycle starts again because personal growth isn't a destination, it's a journey. Karen called it an onion, where you just keep peeling layers back and revealing new, fresh, wonderful things about yourself. And speaking of things that are cyclical, I want to make a quick reminder that this is the final episode for season 5, which means that I have done a solo episode of my own and 19 guest interviews. So now I'm going to take a couple of weeks off to rest and rejuvenate and work on some behind the scenes things that will continue to improve my little podcast. And this will give you a couple of weeks to catch up on any episodes you may have missed in the last couple of months. So I'll be back with some new episodes on Tuesday, October 15th. I can't wait. I've got some great stuff coming up in season 6, some wonderful people, some spectacular stories. So have a couple of great weeks, and I'll see you in October. The 40 Drinks podcast is produced and presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications.